for that short introduction. Yeah, welcome everyone to the 9th session in the African Talk Series, the 10th of March 2022. The African Talk Series is an African interest group initiative which began at the start of the pandemic in 2020 to maximize the lockdown effects on legal professionals by having an informative and interesting conversation. I implore you all to watch previous session on ACL YouTube channel. Today's topic is Devastation, Disruption or Development, Artificial Intelligence and Other Emerging Technologies in Africa and the 21st century. The session seeks to explore the implications of artificial intelligence for countries in Africa and other developing countries, for international law and global governance. The big question is, will artificial intelligence spell devastation, disruption, or development for developing countries? According to a recent McKinsey report, in 2030, there will be a projected global growth of over $30 trillion worth of economy due to artificial intelligence. That's quite massive. Right now, emphasis should be on education of what artificial intelligence is and what artificial intelligence is not. Africa missed out on the first, second, and third revolutions. Africa cannot afford to miss out on the fourth revolution, which is the technological revolution. We have the young minds, and Africa can leapfrog as she did with mobile banking service seen in East Africa. ICT is quite impressive on the continent, with East Africa leading the way, followed by Southern Africa and West Africa. More can be done. The purpose of this conversation is to identify crucial questions that must guide law and policy. This session is co-sponsored by the International Law and Technology Interest Group and in partnership with iResolve Tanzania. It's my pleasure to start the conversation with our keynote speaker, Professor Uche Ewelokwa-Fodile. Professor Uche Ewelokwa-Fodile is a senior fellow of the Mazava Raymond Center for Business and Government at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and a scholar in residence at NYU's Law Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. Professor Ewelokwa-Fodile is a lifetime member of the United States Council on Foreign Relations. Professor Ewelokwa-Fodile is widely published. Her most recent essays include Will Washington Ever Get Around to Regulating Artificial Intelligence? And Businesses and EU's Proposed Artificial Intelligence Act, Major Points of Controversy. Professor Uche Ewelokwa-Fodile is an active member of the American Society of International Law and American Bar Association. Professor Ewelokwa-Fodile obtained her LLB from University of Nigeria, LLM from University College London, and SJD from Harvard Law School. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Uche Ewelokwa-Fodile to give us the keynote speech.
Thank you so much. I'll just want to start by thanking Ijoma and Mohammed for the invitation. When they extended the invitation, I couldn't say no. For one thing, Ijoma is very persistent and she's calling you all the time. And for another thing, it's just a great opportunity to come back, and talk. ASIL is very close to my heart. And it really was an opportunity that I couldn't miss. So I want to say thank you. And I also want to thank the panelists for stepping in. I really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to the conversation. And I'm happy the introduction said it was a conversation because it really is a conversation. I'll try and get through my PowerPoint and then we'll have time to have that great conversation. So I'm just going to load up the screen. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So I have two screens here, so I keep trying. Okay. So again, thank you for that introduction. We'll just start with my definition. There are many definitions of AI. And at least some of them is that AI is the science and engineering of making intelligent machines, especially intelligent computer programs. That's from the guy who was is reputed to be the founding father of AI. Deloitte defines it as it's concerned with getting computers to do tasks that would normally require human intelligence. The European Commission, they've done a lot of work on AI, and they defined it as systems that display intelligent behavior by analyzing their environment, right? And taking action with some degree of autonomy. What is important is that in their definition, it says that AI-based system can be purely software-based, or it could actually be integrated into physical products. One important thing to note is that AI is more like a field of technology, and AI is not one single technology. It's also multi-use. It's not susceptible to one single use. So the field continues to expand as the science comes to fore. So there's some broad fields like vision, robotics, speech, natural language, machine learning, and those are some of the key fields of AI, and those are some of the things that you find in some of the recent applications of AI. I think it's important to also remember that we're still, the development of AI is ongoing, and along that man-machine continuum, some experts make a distinction between narrow or weak AI and strong or general AI. The narrow AI will be where you assist the machine, right? You provide information to the machine and the machine can do a single task or maybe sometimes a multitask. We have not come to the general AI yet, where a machine takes over. I must say that even the whole notion of AI, it only came to my own frame of knowledge because I teach intellectual property. If I wasn't teaching intellectual property and somebody talked about AI, I would just say, oh yeah, I saw it in Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, you know, those robots. But because I teach intellectual property, that's how it even came to my thinking, which is part of why I feel that there are many people that don't even have the idea that AI is something that is affecting our lives and could potentially affect the future. So the AI Index Report 2021, it says that AI systems can now compose text, audio, and images to a sufficiently high degree or high standard that humans have a hard time telling the difference between synthetic and non-synthetic output. That is quite significant. So there's been some things in the news, you know, where AIs come up against humans and AIs actually prevailed. There was a chess game a few years ago and the AI won over the chess champion in the world. There was also a poker game where the AI-powered computer actually won. And there's been other things, right, that AI has been doing. So what are some of the recent applications of AI? We're seeing it in chatbots. So when you say Siri, hey Siri, those are the chatbots. You're seeing it in image recognition, speech recognition, human resources, they're using it quite a bit, real estate, healthcare, autonomous vehicles. So we're now seeing some applications of AI, but nothing quite as much as what is projected in the future. Again, it's important to remember that AI is a technology that can power other technologies. It's a technology that is multi-use. It can be used in many ways. So why am I talking of AI? Why did I decide of all the things I could talk about, why AI? I think there are many reasons, right? One is that adoption has skyrocketed in the past 10 years, right? We see profound, at least there's projected profound national and global impact, right? AI raises a lot of urgent legal, policy, regulatory questions that we can't, as African countries, cannot ignore, right? I think another reason is that, you know, AI is a frontier technology, it's projected to disrupt, and it's important that we're hands-on on these issues. There's a global AI race, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And some countries are already at the very front of the global AI race. And the fact that there's a global AI race makes you to think, okay, what is the outcome for countries in Africa? Some recent statements from WIPO: policymakers will have to move quickly to keep up with AI-related developments and shape the direction of AI evolution. Pricewaterhouse, AI has the potential to create huge economic and societal benefits, but with great potential comes great risks. The WIPO DG, AI's ramification for the future of human development are profound. And Putin, he's been in the news lately, says AI is the future for all humankind. Whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the ruler of the world. That is significant coming from Mr. Putin. So what's the AI landscape, right? Adoption is growing. There's mass surge in AI-based innovation. Investment in AI has skyrocketed in the past 10 years. You know, in 2016, according to McKinsey, corporations invested 20 billion, between 20 billion to 30 billion globally in AI. M&A activity has also gone up in AI, most of them in the last 5 years. Increased patenting, most of them in the last 5 years. Revenue from AI is growing. And when I look at this screen, what I'm thinking is, what is Africa's share of all this? When we talk about M&A, when we talk about increased patenting, how many of those are by Africans or from African institutions? When you talk about AI revenue, so those are things that I hope will inform our discussion. Where is some of the investment going? As you can imagine, investment goes to where the people who have money are interested in. So some of these areas are data security, automation, virtual assistance, business processes, fraud detection, image recognition, financial trading. Those are some of the areas I'm going to go through. And this was from last 2 years. What is interesting, as you can see, medical AI seems to be going quite up. Autonomous vehicles, student courses, and then it goes on and on. Again, when you look at a chart like this, as an African, one thing that comes to my mind is, assuming it was Africans that are designing this, what would they focus on? I'm thinking about the woman in my village. I'm thinking about what would they be focusing on? So those are things that we need to discuss, but this is what the global private investment, where the money is going presently. So I'm going to go to AI, to the question that prompted this discussion. Is it development? Is it devastation? Is it disruption? And like the good lawyer I am, I would say it depends, right? As to at least, so I'm going to start with the development part. I think most of the projections say that AI will bring about a lot of development, a lot of benefits. According to Andrew Ng, AI will transform every facet of society to bring tremendous promise to improve our lives and the world we live in. But it will require the creation of an AI ecosystem to ensure long-term sustainable growth. The adoption rate, you can see some of these areas. Those are areas that can also see potential benefits. Pricewaterhouse published a report recently, and it projected that AI can have a significant impact on sustainable development across multi-sectors, with climate change, with biodiversity, with, you know, ocean, water scarcity, clean air. It makes a great report, right? These are all the projected benefits of AI. In the medical health field, AI in health sector is growing. We were talking about robots doing surgery. We're talking about detection of diseases. We're talking about a lot of great things, okay? In agriculture, which is an area that I've become very interested in, food and agriculture, we see AI also projected to have a major impact. In this day and age when we're dealing with climate crisis, and other crises. The idea that you can use AI to actually power the food and agricultural sector holds a lot of promise. You're talking about precision farming. We're talking about yield forecasting. We're talking about monitoring, targeted monitoring, so that the AI will tell you when your plant needs watering, when it needs fertilizer. It's mind-boggling, but right now there are ongoing research in all these fields. So with agriculture, which is the area, you're thinking about drones. We're thinking about biotech. We're thinking about vertical farming, where countries that don't even have the land can grow a lot of food. I bring it up because it raises questions about competition. Because many times in Africa, we say we have comparative advantage. We have land. But with AI, what does it do? Does it threaten, right? A natural comparative advantage where countries that don't even have land can just with vertical farming and all kinds of develop and actually start exporting food to Africa. This is from Price Waterhouse, and I think it says that it projects about 15.7 trillion value from AI by 2030. Very wonderful news. The question is, when you look at it closely, it breaks it down by regions, right? And it tells you, say in North Africa will capture about 14.5%, right? Southern Europe will capture about 11.5%, right? And so and China will capture as much as 20, so there's a lot of contribution that you can see, and their contribution to GDP. Then what about the rest of the world? The rest of the world, about 1.2 trillion. That includes countries in Africa. So what are we seeing in Africa right now? We are seeing that AI is coming in. It's definitely coming in. So these are some of the examples. In the health sector, early detection and diagnosis, the UBENWA. You see in the health sector, again, Rwanda with zipline drones, agriculture in South Africa, manufacturing, and education too. So AI application is coming on in Africa. That's the good news, right? It's definitely good news. You see a lot of, what do you call it? Yeah, some of these examples in Ghana, in Rwanda, in Kenya. So just to wrap up, when it comes to development.
Which your slide isn't moving. Could you actually make it move, please?
Oh, it's not moving?
It's not moving, yeah, because there's been lots of questions on. We want to see the slide itself, yeah.
So you're not seeing the slides?
We can only see the very first page, which is obviously your name.
Goodness.
No, but it doesn't matter, yeah, just.
Let me see what I can do, because sometimes give me 1 second, okay?
Thank you.
So you're still seeing only the first slide?
Yeah.
Yes, maybe you could put it on slideshow, Uche,
okay,
on the slide.
Okay, give me 1 second, okay? Do you see anything?
Not at all, no, just the first page, Okay,
maybe I have to load it up.
Continue your presentation, then much later you can send the slides, then we can all have it to panelists as well as the attendees. So we don't interrupt the flow of conversation.
Let me see if I can share it again. Just give me 1 second, okay?
Okay. Yeah, the next page, yeah, we can see the second page. The fifth page.
Is it moving?
It's moving.
Is it moving now?
Yes, please, it's moving, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Is it still moving?
Yeah, it's still moving, yeah, it is moving.
Thank you, you all are wonderful. So with development, the question is, are the benefits of AI automatic? They are not. Will the benefits of AI be shared equitably? Will there be winners and losers? And who are the winners? Who are the losers? What is left after the early movers cash out? Those are some of the questions. What about disruption or destruction? I think that there's some, AI raises a lot of concerns. Let me just highlight some of the major risks, and then I'll talk about Africa-specific risks, right? Some of the major risks are safety, national security, human rights, the issue of bias, privacy, public trust, right? Malicious use of AI, civil rights, joblessness. There's also that concern about premature deindustrialization, the fact that AI comes in and gets into the areas where countries in Africa had natural comparative advantage. What about Africa-specific or global South? Are my slides still moving? Sorry.
Yeah? Yes, they're moving. Yes,
okay.
Still moving. Yeah, thank you.
So I think that there's been concerns about power concentration and power distribution with respect to AIs. And this is coming at a time when you have serious geopolitical tension. So AI definitely raises questions about who has power and who does not. There are questions about usability and accuracy. AIs that are primarily developed in the global north, are they even relevant for the African situation? Are they even relevant for the global south? There's a question about the widening gap between rich and poor countries and the fact that this gap is likely to go even wider. There are questions about control and competition, right? There are questions about structural inequalities like the race and culture and gender. There's the danger of one-size-fits-all AI. There's the issue of discrimination. There's also bias. People are talking about even algorithmic oppression and colonialism. So I'm going to just scoot over it. According to the AI Index report, it says that technology necessary for large-scale surveillance are rapidly maturing, with techniques for image classification, face recognition, video analysis, and voice identification all seeing significant progress. A lot of countries are actually buying up those mass surveillance equipment, including countries in Africa. In Africa, there are concerns that AI is creeping into African battlefields. There are questions about where African countries are importing these equipments from. There are concerns about China. These are things that one can think about, especially with many African countries, part of the China Belt and Road Initiative. What is involved in the Belt and Road? And is that the pathway for some of these surveillance mechanisms to come into the continent? There's also the issue of what people call the whiteness of AI. There's been discussions even in the United States that the whiteness of AI means that what you put in is what you get, right? And AI can lead to bias. It can lead to bias in the financial market. It can lead to bias when you're going to get credit. It can lead to bias in jobs, interviews, because the AI can, there are things it recognizes and there are things it does not recognize. Gender is also a concern. So the whiteness of AI, and you can Google it, the question is, what does that mean for countries in Africa when most of the development of AI is in the global north? This is what a report from Brookings. It says AI is perhaps most widely used in Africa in areas with high level of violence to increase the capability and coordination of law enforcement. For instance, 14 African countries deploy AI-driven surveillance and smart policing platforms. Of course, one person's law enforcement could be another person's repression. My concern really is that many times these things are not debated. We don't even know that they're being used. So it's something that one can discuss later, right? When it comes to warfare, experts project that the landscape of warfare is going to change. There's a global control of information that talks about digital authoritarianism. A lot of warfare will be, no longer with boots on the ground, but with information warfare. What does that mean for countries in Africa? What does it mean for sovereignty? So is AI a double-edged sword for international development? Who designs? For whom? For what purpose? Do poor countries have the ability and resources to minimize the risks associated with AI? Can they maximize the benefits? Those are my questions. Disruption. AI has been called the king of disruptors, right? AI is projected to disrupt everything. According to Pricewaterhouse, the titanic shift and ongoing disruption caused by AI is said to be similar to that caused by the introduction of personal computer in 1980s. AI will lay the foundation for an immense acceleration in innovation throughout and beyond the coming decade. Few people today can envision what AI will mean to us over the coming decades. So what are the fields that will be disrupted? Pretty much every field. Agriculture is one of those. Energy and mining, IP, retail, pretty much every sector. I want to talk very quickly about AI and the law, because we are all lawyers. There are several ways that AI is going to be disrupting the law, right? AI is creating new entities not covered by domestic or international law. Robots, drones, right? When a robot causes harm, do you hold the robot? Do you hold the manufacturer? Do you hold the insurer? What do you do? AI is going to enable new behavior that was not contemplated by existing laws. AI is enabling the circumvention of existing laws, including existing international law. AI is equipping old entities with new capabilities. AI is changing the incentive and the value of key stakeholders. Let's think about it both at the domestic level and at an international level, right? Again, with law, AI is already disrupting the legal market. And it's going to, so all of us, whether you are in arbitration or in IP, or you're just a traditional lawyer, AI apps are coming up, right? And you may be surprised that with time, the law firms in Africa may be closing because jobs are, the AIs here are doing all the jobs. You don't even need to go to Nigeria to do it, okay? So questions, how can countries in Africa leverage or prepare for AI's disruption? I raised that because Pricewaterhouse released a report leveraging the upcoming disruption. So the disruption is gonna come. The question is, how do you prepare and leverage? So how are we? How is AI's disruption challenging international law and multilateralism and global governance? That's the question I would like us to discuss. How should international lawyers and international institutions and organizations respond to AI's disruption? Should we ignore it? Should we address it? Should that be the next topic for ASIL's general meeting? Something to think about. So what about Africa's readiness? And I need to kind of move fast. African readiness, we're seeing some tech hubs coming up in Africa. Africa is increasingly part of the value chain. We have some big techs in Africa now, IBM, Google, Microsoft, Amazon. Some VC, venture capital funding is coming in. An AI ecosystem is developing. As the next map shows you, you see, I want us to look at this map. On the one hand, there's good news and bad news. If you were my students, I will ask you the questions, but you're not my student, right? So the good news is that we see some things coming up, right? We see some things. The bad news is that there are a lot of empty spaces, right? A lot of these developments are in Eastern Africa, Southern Nigeria, but there's so many empty spaces. What does that mean for the future? That's something to think about. So even when we say, oh, Africa, we already have AI startups, we're in Africa, right? Let me move quickly. We have some healthcare startups coming up in Africa. That's good news. We have some ecosystem coming up, right? The deep learning in Indaba. There's some AI Expo. There are a number of things that are already being discussed. So I'm not suggesting that we have a complete empty slate. There are. So I'm gonna scoot up, go past the African readiness. There's a report called the Global AI Readiness Index, and I suggest that we all take a look at it at some point. It measures the readiness of countries around several pillars. It looks at data and infrastructure. It looks at technology sector, and it looks at the government, right? With technology, it looks at innovation capacity, human capital size, adaptability, infrastructure. So they're looking at a lot of things. How does Africa fare? Well, there's no country in Africa that is in the top 50, right? Only 9 countries in Africa are in the top 100. And those countries are what you see on the screen. Nigeria is not there, but you see Mauritius at number 58, Egypt at 65, South Africa at 68, and it goes on. I think that that's not good, right? In 2019, Africa Union started an AI working group, and I'm not, that's the much I can tell you, okay? What about the African business sector? Because there's the issue about government readiness, but there's also an issue of private sector readiness. How is the African private sector getting ready? Then across the board, there are many countries that their private sector are hands-on into AI in terms of the process, in terms of technology, in terms of organization. I'll highlight something that a recent report said. I want you to take a look. It says the central challenge that Africa faces in deploying AI is often overlooked. Africa's biggest companies, its national champions, are not zealously championing the cause of AI or deploying AI's application widely. The few that have invested in AI have incurred above average costs because they have imported talents and technology. With limited bargaining power vis-a-vis foreign digital giants and having failed so far to develop local talent, African companies run the risk of being less competitive than their multinational rivals in their home markets. Let it sink a bit. In Africa's home market, we can become less competitive. They say that today's company-specific AI gap will be tomorrow's national competitiveness chasm. Unless African companies actively drive the development of AI, African nations will never be able to leapfrog global rivals. That is significant. The last thing they'll say is that African companies can help create an AI ecosystem that can lower their development costs, help create AI applications tailored to local needs, and reduce their dependence on foreign companies. So, in as much as my talk is directed at government, it's also directed at the private sector. So when it comes to AI readiness, we see a massive global divide, right? There's high inequality across the board. Most of the development is occurring in developed countries and in the biggest economies. Within Africa, we also see a big divide. So the problem is that at the national level, most countries in Africa do not have an AI policy or an AI strategy. Only 2 countries in Africa have developed an AI strategy. That's Mauritius. And the second is Egypt, right? Many countries lack robust data protection laws. Countries in Africa rank poorly on development index, digital index, any kind of index, right? There's few decisive steps to bolster or redesign existing government institutions to prepare for the digital world. At the regional level, AI is not integrated into the continental plan. There's an AI working group, but AI is not even built into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. There's as yet no continental-wide approach. There's data protection, there's no continental-wide approach. There's really, so there's a lot of things to make up. Then you deal with the diversity. I've talked about it before, so I'm not going to dwell on it. So what then? I'm going to rush through here because I've talked a lot. I come up with 9 Ds, and you're like, Prof. Sucha must have a thing with Ds, right? And if you're trying to find out what I have with D, I have nothing much with D, but it suited my presentation. So what do we need to do? I think African countries need to develop AI strategy, AI ecosystem, AI targeted policies. I think we need to destroy barriers and design appropriate response to those barriers. I think we need a lot of debate in Africa. We need to debate policy. We need to debate ethics. We need to debate governance. I think we need to demand, African countries need to demand a seat at the table. They need to demand and discuss issues about corporate responsibility, right? We need to think about digital readiness in Africa. We need to think about how to democratize the AI landscape. We need to take data governance very seriously, right? Because right now, the governance, you don't hear a lot of African countries talking about it, but data governance is coming in through investment treaties, it's coming in through free trade agreements. Some of it is going on through the WTO. There's a need to dialogue and diplomacy, and there's a need to decenter. I think I'm going to just take another 5 minutes and run through this, and then I'll stop, right? When it comes to development, there's a lot of things to do when it comes to AI policy landscape. You're talking about research and development. You're talking about innovation, talent. You're talking about education and skills acquisition, standard setting, security. There's international affairs, there's workforce and labor. There's a long list of policy issues that countries must have to address. Without an AI strategy, I don't see how countries will start discussing any of these things, right? So the long list of policy issues are waiting for countries to deal with, okay? Domestic law needs to change. I think you heard me mention that South Africa was the first country in the world to issue patent to an AI, not to the individual that came up with the AI, but to the AI itself. And I'm not sure there was a lot of debate in South Africa about that, but in United States and in UK, there's been a lot of debate about whether patents should be given to an AI or to an individual. And the courts in the US and UK, for the most part, said, well, we can't issue patents to a robot, you know? But South Africa has issued that, which may be good or bad, except that I did not hear much of a domestic debate in South Africa about that. Let me suggest that AI is going to challenge every area of law, from IP law to tort law. So for example, when a robot, you walk across the road and a driverless car knocks you down, do you sue the robot or the insurance company or the manufacturer or the vendor? The tort law needs to change, and we don't always have to wait for the northern countries to come up with the law and then we copy. We need to develop our own local response to this. These things need to be debated and discussed. Tax law. How do you tax robots? How do you tax data? Now they say that data is a new oil. If data is a new oil, you better think of the issues about taxation, right? I think we need to design appropriate response to all the challenges I've mentioned. So I'm going to skip, but I've mentioned all this. So what is the appropriate response to our educational system, right? A lot of countries in Africa have completely broken educational system, especially as relates to STEM. AI at the tertiary level, very few schools teach AI or even emphasize computer science, very few schools, right? We need to debate. There's a lot of things to debate. There's gender, there's cost benefit, there's vulnerability. I don't hear much of those debates going on right now in countries in Africa. At the international level, African countries must debate. We must engage in discussions about AI and trade, AI and environment, AI and there's a lot to debate. My concern right now is that a lot of the discussions about global governance is happening in a fragmented way and not in a multilateral setting. Why does it matter? Because it's fragmented, these principles are now being formed without African participation, right? If it was at the UN, then many countries may have a voice, but because it's at the G20 or OECD, these principles are now coming up without a lot of voice from the global South. So you have the intergovernmental initiatives. You also have private sector initiatives coming up with principles, but most of the tech giants are not in Africa, right? So those are things that we need to think about. I'm going to skip digital readiness. We can discuss that later. Democratization, we can discuss that later because I want to, let me just say a thing. Why does democracy matter? This is what Mustafa is the Google, he heads the Google AI lab in Accra. He says the vast majority of experts are in North America, Europe, and Asia. Africa in particular is barely represented. Such lack of diversity can entrench unintended biases and build discrimination into AI system. And that's not the only gap. Fewer African AI researchers and engineers mean fewer opportunities to use AI to improve the lives of Africans. The research community is also missing out on talented individuals simply because they have not received the right education, right? So there are a lot of things. One area, and so I talk about decentering. I'll give you an example because the EU came out with a draft regulation. And the draft regulation has received a lot of, some people love it, some people don't, but it was really an EU thing, right? The draft regulation maps out AI risks. Some the EU said are unacceptable risks, some are high risk, some are limited risk, some are minimal risk. My question is, assuming this was a discussion in Africa, how do we classify risk? Will it be the same as the EU risks? Will we classify it differently? These are things, that is why it's important to have these discussions, decentering at the global, at the regional, at the national, and at the community level. So this is where I end. It's a human-centric, development-oriented, equitable, inclusive, empowering, context-driven AI. Is it possible? How do we make it happen? What is the appropriate role for states, international organizations, corporations, civil society in AI governance? What is the appropriate regulatory framework for AI? Should we let the private sector lead? Should it be public sector? Should it be fragmented? Should it be within a multilateral setting like the UN? Is there a need for specific global norms or binding standards for research, production, and use of AI? And this is where I stop. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor. We've enjoyed it. So much to think about. Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to minimize the slides? Is that okay?
Yes.
Minimize it. Okay. Thank you.
Stop slide share. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay. We'll move on to the next speaker. There's been a change of speakers now because we're yet to have Professor Daniel Makina join us from South Africa. So there's been a change of order of response to this presentation. The next speaker will be Damien Croker, followed by Dr. Ujede Jofa Obasi, followed by Madeleine Kimei. Then lastly, Professor Nyeka Osuji. My pleasure to welcome Mr. Damien Croker. Mr. Damien Croker is a legal technology entrepreneur and an alternative dispute resolution practitioner with a focus on technology sector. Damien is the co-founder of Odia Plat, an online dispute resolution platform, and founder of LexDeck, an online intellectual property services platform. Damien is an experienced and international business executive in the technology sector. He has worked in a wide range of technology areas, including telecoms, internet infrastructure, cybersecurity, and software applications. Damien wrote the proprietary algorithm behind the R3 index, which uniquely enables focus on those websites causing a brand most revenue and reputational risk. Damien has contributed to IP protection articles for various media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, CNN, and CNBC. Damien is currently working with a number of organizations to increase access to justice on the African continent through the use of low-cost technological solutions. My pleasure to welcome Mr. Damien Croker.
Oh, thank you. And well, thank you for interesting start to this conversation. So I'd like to go back to the initial introduction, which said that Africa had missed out on the first, second, and third generation. Well, controversially, maybe, but it's not inconsistent with the start of this discussion. I think Africa is going to miss out this time too, because there's not the investment going in. The UNESCO, I just happen to have the figures in front of me, surprisingly, I reckon that in sub-Saharan Africa, in researchers and development, the share of GDP is around 0.5%, which compared to China is 2%, and the EU is also 2%. So the investment in research and development isn't happening. So therefore, behind already. In terms of the amount of researchers, in terms of new staff, per million inhabitants in sub-Saharan Africa, there are 124 people. Compared to China of 13, they have 1,307, and the EU has 4,000. So there's not that initial investment right now to create the innovation. And to take the point, I've heard mention of Google and Amazon being Africa. There's this real risk that the history of Africa is people from outside coming in and taking the wealth out. And that's what's happening right now and will continue to happen unless governments change things, unless their policies, as already been said, are changed so that laws, only 17 out of 54 African countries have a data protection law. Data protection is probably the fundamental basis of AI. It's how we get protected, because AI is basically reading an algorithm, reading databases, and there's a lack of databases to read, let alone in Africa. But need protection of your rights. They're familiar with the facial recognition that was being talked about, surveillance. There are no laws to protect the citizens of Africa from that right now, except in 17 countries. So just the basics don't exist today in Africa. And so those things need to change if there's to be that. But there's such opportunity. There are the skills and the ability in Africa. I work with African people every day. Obviously, you guys know lots of African people who are well able to do this stuff. And it's a lack of infrastructure and support. Let's also think about AI. Let's imagine it does explode in Africa. That needs an infrastructure. It needs an infrastructure of data centers. At the core of all this, data centers. Data centers are huge consumers of energy. African countries are also involved in SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. There's an inconsistency in investment in AI and meeting certain SDG goals, because carbon emissions just go through the roof unless you invest in your renewable energy. Investment in renewable energy in of itself could create devastation for certain economies. Nigeria is very dependent on oil revenue, for example, as are some other African countries. Well, if there was a switch to renewable energy, some countries would suddenly have no revenue. So there's some political issues there. So I want to be positive in what I have to say. The reality is right now, unless there are some changes in policy, and IP, you mentioned, sorry, IP as well, you mentioned that. Now, it was quite interesting, the South African decision about, yes, AI can create its own IP, which was inconsistent with the decisions that have been made, as you said, in the UK and the US. How's that going to sit? Is there going to be some worry about investing even? Because new stuff that may not belong to that American company or to that Chinese company in that country. So there may be some issues around that as well. So I don't want to take up any more time. There is some serious policy decisions, legal, that need to be done, and it's just not happening right now. And there's a big gulf, and it's only going to get worse unless urgent action's taken. Anyway, that's my input. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you for that. Thank you. The next speaker is Dr. Ujue Bassi. Dr. Ujue Bassi is an attorney for the U.S. Small Business Administration. Dr. Bassi has a strong international law background and solid professional experience spanning 3 international organizations, namely the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Dr. Ujue Bassi holds a PhD in International Investment Arbitration from Queen Mary University of London, an LLM from International Business Law from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and an LLB from the University of Nigeria. Dr. Ujue Bassi is licensed to practice law in Nigeria, New York, and awaiting admission to the Californian Bar. Dr. Bassi serves as the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority arbitrator. Dr. Ujue Bassi is passionate about the African continent, more so its international dispute resolution mechanisms. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Ujue Bassi.
Thank you, Ijoma, and thank you for inviting me, and I am honored to be on the panel with the rest of the panelists. Professor Uche and Damien, they covered a lot of, quite a number of, almost all the areas that are crucial to this conversation. And so from all indications, AI is here to stay, and the benefits are demonstrable. You know, with advancements in industries such as power, healthcare, transportation, financial services, and as Damien pointed out, there's also evidence that AI has the potential to help achieve sustainable development goals. AI also has the potential to resolve many of the challenges facing Africa. We've seen a modest growth in the AI ecosystem. There are applications addressing gaps in medical services, medical access, financial services. Africa is fertile ground. And since it has the world's youngest population, this signifies youthful and energetic workforce. For Africa, AI presents another path to economic development. So how is Africa addressing the risks and challenges that AI presents? Damien also pointed this out about the meeting sustainable development goals. It's there's a Brookings Institute report that points out that the goals and targets across Africa, there's been an uneven progress in the implementation of SDGs. And we know that one of the things the report recommends is addressing data gaps. We know that AI relies on data, so it is important to address this challenge of gathering, using, and storing data in order for Africa to use AI to meet its goals. And since development of AI technologies is heavily concentrated in a small number of advanced economies, the risk of this kind of market concentration is dependency and social marginalization of the less developed countries and underrepresented groups from the global economy. Data analysis can be biased when data sets are not comprehensive or representative of the entire set of a group or range of cases. And this leads sometimes to inaccurate and unfair outcomes. AI talent is scarce. An IFC report notes that a significant gap in supply and demand exists across all levels of digital skills in Africa. Skilled worker movements from Africa to technologically advanced countries contribute to the shortage of AI talent. Some of the ways to increase and retain this supply is through STEM education, training, and retraining. Okay, being that it's International Women's Month, it's very important to address the issue of AI and women. Africa, as we all know, has a gender inequality problem. There is also a lot of stereotyping when it comes to job roles. Most employed women are employed in the informal sector. It's good to note that a number of African governments have established or are working on frameworks to tackle this gender gap. And the scarcity of AI talent is even more amongst women. Women constitute only about 30% of tech professionals in Africa. Luckily, the UN Women is one of the organizations working to close this digital gender gap in Africa. It implemented the African Girls Can Code initiative to train girls in critical coding and tech skills. Basically, the digital gender gap is not good economics. It results in gender biases in AI-powered devices, thereby furthering stereotypes. Research and development in AI in Africa, even with all the challenges, is mostly driven by the private sector. So far, a few African governments have incorporated technology into their national economies. This makes them better placed to adopt AI technologies and use AI to improve delivery of public services. Like Professor Uche mentioned, Mauritius, South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Cape Verde, they're all at the top of that list. There needs to be a concerted effort to create enabling frameworks for the development and use of AI by governments. Some countries have regulations or laws that cover aspects of the scope of AI, like data protection. But most countries, or rather the laws vary significantly from country to country in Africa, and there are no uniform set of rules for the continent. There's the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, which was drafted in 2011, but only adopted in 2014. As of June 2020, the convention has only been ratified by 8 out of 55 AU members, while 14 countries have signed but not ratified it. The AU also developed a digital transformation strategy for Africa to guide a common coordinated response to reap the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution by harnessing digital technologies and innovation. I mean, on paper, some progress is being made, but there's more to be done. You know, more action that people need to, or rather countries need to step up and take this seriously. We also need to think about how countries use AI to control political narratives, manipulate existing information in the public domain to spread disinformation, and how they use the space to monitor their citizens and repress voices. Very importantly in this discussion, the quality, we all know that the quality of a democracy matters. It impacts AI. Where you have good governance, technology has the potential to improve the lives of people, while bad governance breeds discrimination, breach of human rights, and limits the chances of competing or even sharing in the AI space. To design effective tech solutions, it is important to be sensitive to different contexts, backgrounds, values, cultures. Africa has so many different, but I mean, we're a continent, but the values and cultures are different. So attention needs to be paid to that. Africa needs to be involved not only in the design of AI tech, but in the shaping of ethical frameworks that guide AI research, because solutions that result from non-inclusiveness can never be fully suitable or beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uju, for that. That was good. The next speaker is Ms. Madeleine Kimia. Ms. Madeleine is a practicing commercial and corporate lawyer an ODR advocate, as well as the founder and principal director of iResolve, a fully fledged arbitration practice in Tanzania. Madeline provides alternative dispute resolution consultancies and represents parties in both domestic commercial arbitration and acts as the arbitrator, commercial mediator, as well as arbitral secretary in both domestic and international arbitrations. Madeline is the president of the Tanzania Institute of Arbitrators, also a trainer on ODR, online dispute resolution, to various institutions globally. It's my pleasure to welcome Ms. Madeline Kimi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ejoma. Thank you to Professor Uche for a wonderful presentation on the devastation, disruption, or development in artificial intelligence, focusing in on Africa and the 21st century. Where are we? And I agree, I fully agree with my colleagues, the distinguished panelists that are with me today in discussing this very hot topic. And when I say hot, is the factor that has come out from the discussions that the African participants are nowhere to be seen. And that is why it is hot. Why are they not there? What I say to the statement that it is not that AI is coming up in Africa, I'm actually going to retract and say AI is here. We're witnessing it, we're using it, and we're enabled by it in so many different ways. And I think that picked up upon the eruption of the COVID-19 pandemic and post-pandemic initiatives by African governments, African players, the private sector, and those who took reach for that opportunity. So it is here, it is disruptive, and how do we react? This is the question. I foresee, and I will pick on different aspects of my issues because some of them have already been covered. I foresee colossal legal risks associated with this growth, and it's rapid. These changes that are happening, and they are happening due to the artificial intelligence that is easily accessible by us. Now, when I say easily accessible, in November 2019, for example, in Tanzania, the central bank announced that the legal ledger or the legal trading authorized are the notes and coins issued by the bank, and that it did not recognize cryptocurrencies or any other sort of digital currency. Now, if I fast forward that to the recent address of our president informing the central bank governor to go back to his desk and prepare for the evolution that is going to be taking part, especially with the digital economy that is embedded in the strategy of the government, the digitalization of the economy that goes hand in hand with the African Union initiatives that we've been speaking about, and the AfCFTA. For it to work, to properly work, these African states have to digitalize processes, be it importation issues, be it custom duties, taxation elements. All these have to be digitalized in order to see the African Continental Free Trade Agreement work, and work in the manner that we have envisioned it to work. And so cryptocurrency is now on the table of our governors. And we've seen other African governors work towards implementing, and I think I heard when I was in Lagos a few years ago, that was also a hot debate within the central bank units of the Nigerian government, that cryptocurrencies need to be looked at, and there needs to be a robust legal framework to be put forward. Now I go back to the statement that AI is here again. Why do I say this? I say this because statistics dating back 2018 at a certain business summit that happened in Singapore indicated that the African e-market will be 75 billion worth by 2025, and it will be driven by the youth. Remember, the youth make up 70% of the African continent. We, the youth, are smart people. We use smart contracts. We want the cryptocurrency. I do not work with cash. actually, and I call myself part of the youth, although I'm going on to the next band soon. So we are youth, and we will trigger the accelerated AI for it to be applicable, maybe we're saying near future, but it is now. Another recent report in front of me is the E-Economy Africa report. This was done by the IFC in collaboration with Google. And they also went on to look at more recent data. And in that analysis, they go on to say Africa's internet economy has the potential to reach 180 billion by the same year that I referred to earlier. And so there's a mixed statistics here. Why are we being involved in creating these statistics? This is the problem. So the statistics on the research and the research that we can access tells us that we're going to be 75 billion in 2025, and then there's 180 billion in 2025. Which one are we to believe? African players need to get in the picture so that the data is clear and the data speaks to the African continent itself. Now, I'll move on away from reports because there's another ITU report that I wanted to refer to, but that talks about the lack of infrastructure issue. I noted from the presentation that there are specific issues in Africa, meaning, electricity, power concentration, distribution, and geopolitical issues. I agree. But this report says that these are not the issues. These are not the main reasons why the numbers are low, especially with internet usages, which of course support the use of AI as well. So the bigger picture, they think, is the living, the different living areas associated with internet, or the access to the access of AI, and these are the factors that are really sort of slowing us down. So it is the access, the ease of access, as opposed to the infrastructural issues that we can talk about. And so that's in addition to. I know my time is tight, but I wanted to talk about the cultural issue that came out from Professor Uju's presentation, and I wanted to touch on that because it's very sensitive. The African continent, as Professor Uche has highlighted, is unique in its own setting. And so these regulatory frameworks, policies, guides, protocols need to speak to the values of the African continent, need to speak and align to the cultural setups of these different countries on the continent. We have civil and common law countries, remember that as well. And so there's that differences in the legislative frameworks of these countries in the continent. And so it is really bringing out a lot of issues that we all need to get to the drawing table and have a brainstorming session on how we can have this, create a robust or conducive framework to assist and capitalize on artificial intelligence as we expect it to be. Now, from the presentation, I also noted the issue of data protection. Data protection laws, for example, in countries such as Tanzania, are not in place. And yes, this poses a big risk. We're one of those countries out of those 17 mentioned that we do not have a policy on data protection laws. And this area of data, of big data that we speak of, this is already within the different communities that you would sit in, and big data is demanded. Big data is already a major issue within organizations. Data centers have been opened, and so on and so forth. So the telecommunication laws, the authorities need to look back and say, okay, we've put forward cybersecurity policies, we've put forward regulations to curb criminals in the cyberspace, but what about protecting the privacy of those dealing within these platforms? I think this really needs to be looked at. When I also say that AI is already here, and I think I have a few seconds left now, is that in a recent address to lawyers, new enrolled advocates in Tanzania, to the bar, the Chief Justice of Tanzania, Honorable Professor Ibrahim Juma, intimated to the youth, the young lawyers, that it is about time that they look into a profession that is away from the law, from the usual courtrooms, and look into ODR. And this is the Chief Justice speaking to young lawyers. And so we can already sort of feel what he has seen in terms of the challenges that are posed in the near future. He has introduced recently electronic filing regulations. Our courts have been highly systemized since the pandemic. We are able to do virtual hearings. We're able to file our cases online, to search the databases and have them, interrelate with certain concepts of the law. That is already assisting our efficiency as lawyers. And so I understand that AI is crippling in, but also it has already crippled in enough for us to now have our attention and focus on how do we then respond to this fourth revolution, industrial revolution. I've seen governments have government strategies in place in order to be digitalized. The strategy is a very good move. And I think I saw that on one of the slides of Professor Uche. And pulling in resources in terms of creating that enabling environment. Our schools, our universities, I wait to hear from the professor. Are we putting forward curriculums and similar causes for us to be enabled to know what is this AI? From Professor Uche's initial remarks, she said to us, this definition, it's not airtight yet. There's no legal definition, but can be known in terms of us teaching ourselves to understand better what is this AI, and not just hear about AI and understand it in the general sense. So thank you so much for that opportunity. Thank you, Ijoma.
Thank you, Madeline, for that. That was good. So many questions to choose, so many things to think about. We'll get to the Q&A session at some point. The next and the final speaker is Professor Onyeka Osuji. Professor Onyeka Osuji is a professor of law at the School of Law, University of Essex, and the Director of Commercial Law Postgraduate Taught Programs. Professor Onyeka Osuji is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, United Kingdom. Professor Osuji holds a PhD in law from the University of Manchester, a BCR from the University of Oxford, and an LLB from the University of Nigeria. Professor Onyeka Osuji, AHRC funded a technological licensing framework for 3D printed content, a focus on China, was cited by Baroness Neville Rodge, the former Minister for Intellectual Property. Professor Onyeka Osuji is interested in the intersection between law and technology on the African continent. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Onyeka Osuji to respond to Professor Uche Ewelukwa for today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joma. Thank you to you and the rest of the organizers for inviting me. And thank you to the panelists. I've listened carefully to what everyone has said. And big thanks to Professor Uche Ewelukwa Fodile for your presentation. Very wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it, but I didn't quite enjoy it. And I will explain why. In the first place, when you talked about the range of applications for AI, the opportunities, I sat up, I was enjoying it very well. But when you moved on to the risk, the concerns, one of the things that came to my mind was what I heard somewhere else. Somebody was saying something like, science without ethics is dangerous. but ethics without science. We mean lack of development. I've just paraphrased. I'm not sure that's the exact quotation. So it made me to start thinking of some of those different issues which you did raise, very profound issues. And the last bit I didn't quite enjoy was when you threw up the challenge of Africa's readiness. And I think it's obvious to everyone here, the continent is not ready as a unit. The continent is not ready if one looks at the different countries involved. And within the sub-national units, the continent is not ready. I was also interested in the point you made about readiness, not just of governments, but also about the private sector. So I agree with the point made by the points made by the various panelists. Let me try and focus on one area as a lawyer, in terms of the challenge posed by Professor Uche Olukwafodile about the appropriate response. How do we respond? So I started from enjoying, not enjoying. Then when the challenge about response came, I said, okay, I've enjoyed it in overall on a balance. So let me focus on that bit of the challenges. As a lawyer, one of the things I've been thinking about with regards to AI is it an old wine in new bottle? Or is it a new wine in old bottle? Or a new wine in new bottle? How do we look at AI? And when you go back to different technologies, when they emerge, they're seen as disruptive. How does the law address the challenges they pose? How does the law as well facilitate the exploitation of the potential they can provide? So, for me, it's two ways, and I think Professor Olukwafodile made that clear, that when we look at AI, is about the opportunities, it's also about the challenges, the concerns. How can the law look at that? And I go back to when internet became a popular thing, the reaction from a place like the European Union was, the initial reaction was to say, this is a force for good. Let us protect the internet intermediaries. So the legal framework was there to protect them for more than 2 decades. It's just of recent that people started talking about harmful internet content. That now would take me to what do we do in Africa as a continent. One of the panelists mentioned the AU Digital Transformation Strategy document and the convention. So there's some activity going on there. But I think one fundamental difference between Africa as a continent and Europe is the African Union. Even though it's moved on from the OAU as a club of states, is still thinking, working, and organizing itself as a club of states. And in comparison to the European Union, which now sees itself not just as a club, but as an agent for development of the region. So if you look at the process of the lawmaking in Europe, how they get the private sector involved, different levels of society. So, panelists have been talking about business, about education sector. Some of the conversations being held in Europe are facilitated by the EU. So it's not simply about get the document out or get the convention. If you get the different sectors of society involved, let's say in the process of looking at the response of Africa as a continent, the AI, they will be part of national environment, subnational environment, do what they can. And that also goes to the issue of ratification, because it's seen as a club. There are a lot of people, some of us academics, we don't even know what is happening in with the AU. What about, let me use the word ordinary people. How are they going to know what is going on? So who pushes for ratification by national governments? Because of that disconnect in what the original body does. And we talked about the infrastructural deficit in most of the countries, but as one united body using the African Union, the continent can use the regional institutions to champion development of the continent. And we can go back a little bit to the response to the Ebola crisis. How it was coordinated. That's one example of trying to get things done. So for me, if we want to see a change in African countries, AI, the challenges it poses, we have to see how we can reframe the regional body to see itself as a tool for development, as a tool for using international law for private rights, for obligations, for ordinary people. And with that, one can be able to say, okay, this is the standard. And at the same time, also think about the kind of values the African regional system can say, okay, this is what is context specific. This is what suits. Because whatever happens, the international economic system, the international economic law system is not really designed to favor the African continent. And that's the fact. So until the continent ceases to say, how do we use our region, 54 countries with enormous potential, come together to address some of these issues, exploit some of the opportunities raised by AI, we are going to have a system designed from outside the continent, used by or exploited, managed by people, organizations outside the continent, and enforced using a system designed not to favor the continent. So for me, those are some of the issues I can raise. So, and I think the last point to note, and I would thank Professor Ewolukwa for that, is the need for understand some of those issues. Being able to work across disciplines. But that's one of the lessons I've learned from the presentation. We have to think, as a lawyer, being able to work with social scientists, work with the technologies to understand what the issues are in order to design solutions that can help. Work with humanists, people who can think about the human aspect of whatever technology. So at the end, I think I've ended up with more questions for myself than answers. And one of the questions I've been thinking is, should we address AI on an issue by issue basis or as one general framework? I suspect we may have to do a bit of both. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sijit. Thank you for that. We'll go right to the next segment. Professor Uche, would you want to respond to this series of questions, or would you want us to? Okay, let's go straight to the questions. You answer the question, then we're going to the interactive session where we all talk together, exchange ideas, and obviously throw up questions that have actually come up with all this presentation, responses rather. So Professor Uche, could you please respond to the questions that have actually come up? And let's take it from there.
I wouldn't want to take up much time. I really thank you so much for your responses. I agree with pretty much what everybody else has said. First with Damien, he was right on point. We are not ready. That is basically it. And right now, we were not ready for the first and second and third revolutions, and we are not ready. Are we using AI now? Yes, just as Madeline said, we're using it. And as I showed in my presentation, it's already here in Africa. The question is who gets to control it? It's about power, it's about control, it's about putting the mechanisms in place to make sure that you can take the benefits and minimize the cost. Unfortunately, that enabling environment is just not there right now, both from the government perspective and from the private sector. We're not seeing that readiness. And with much else, I think that we are, if you even look at other areas, and I digress now to say, maybe look at food and agriculture, where Africa, even with all the resources that we have, with all the comparative advantage in land, where most African countries are net food importing countries. So I think that we see that in a lot of sectors in the extractive industry. And unless something is done urgently, we risk being marginalized beyond where we are now. And from my research, you see, and even when you look at the AI Readiness Index, we can't even compare as Africa to other emerging economies, right? When it comes to AI, China is right up there, but countries like Malaysia and Brazil and India are making serious headway on multiple fronts. So I think that when we look at Africa and the West, we kind of say, oh, there's no point, they're better. But what about other emerging economies that are putting in place significant changes, right? Somebody talked about investment in R&D. That is true. That the investment in R&D in Africa is so minuscule that it's laughable. Most African countries do not take that seriously. How a country can survive in today's world without investing massively in research and development and human development and infrastructure, I don't know how you're going to do that, right? If you look at the education scene that we talked about, even in Africa, the public education is almost broken, right? In Nigeria, for example, we see private schools springing up and most of them are not regulated. There's no standard. So we have a major problem. The hope, as Madeline mentioned, is Africa has youths, right? The question though is whether the youth in Africa will translate into, will it yield dividend for the country? It may or may not, depending on what countries in Africa do, right? It's not automatic that because we have the largest youth population in the world, that is going to translate into development benefits. The number of reports that have shown that it can actually lead to a major crisis, right? In terms of, these youths can be dragged into other areas, terrorism, right? alternative. There are many ways that, so this is the moment of decision making. The question that we all may have to think is, how do we as lawyers, since sometimes we're in our own bubble, how can, and that was why I chose this topic, right? How can we as lawyers get that discussion going beyond ASIL in the continent? And Professor Osuji talked about interdisciplinary, which is true. AI is all about, policy coherence, interdisciplinarity. The data scientists, the lawyer, the economists, they all come together. We're not used to that in many African countries, right? In many African countries, we're all in small pockets. And that's why there's a lot of policy incoherence, right? And so maybe we as lawyers, maybe we can be the ones to start that discussion and start it well. And initially we might get resistance because the data scientists are going to say, what do you know, right? What do you know? But the law and lawyers, we can provide the framework for having that debate that is necessary. One problem in Africa is lack of transparency, right? One day you hear, oh, the Nigerian government set up a Ministry of Digital Affairs, but there was no discussion, right? There's very little discussion and transparency. So even when it appears that things are happening, they don't work because there was very little discussion. You might wake up tomorrow and hear, oh, this country has an AI strategy, but nobody knew about it, right? So I think that the time is right to talk about transparency in Africa, to talk about inclusiveness, to talk about data. Let me say, I talked about data before, and I say it again because I work with investment treaties and international trade agreements. And that's how I in data issues started coming, to my, I started noticing that because there are a lot of trade agreements where data issues are woven in, and many countries sign, and they don't even know what they're signing, right? A lot, and I only noticed it in the last 2 or 3 years. And what is the problem? Many of our countries sign treaties that they don't understand. They sign treaties that they do not read. And they sign treaties that without little discussion. And days are gone. And I think days are really gone when African countries will talk about capacity. I'm talking about legal. Because even when we reach out to them and say, hey, I can provide free service, nobody wants you because you're going to come in to spoil their show. I don't know about you guys, but that's my experience, and then later on the same government said, we have no capacity. Nobody told us. We're telling you now. And somebody talked about AU. I think it begs discussion. It's something that needs to be discussed. What is the role of AU as a regional body? There are two things that have come out from the EU that confirms what Professor Osigi is talking. One is the EU AI regulation. Just very briefly, EU has been discussing this AI regulation for some time. They came out with a draft. They invited public consultation. They even formed a working group, a multi-sector, more interdisciplinary working group. Now they've come up with a draft. That draft is going to go through several debates. The civil society has commented on this draft. And I don't know and of course, you know that the EU Parliament is very active. The AU Parliament is not active. There's a structure for AU Parliament, but that is not functional yet because the AU Parliament would have been a voice that would channel things from the grassroots all the way to the AU, but right now it's not active. A second thing that just happened in the last 2 weeks was the EU came out with a draft directive on due diligence, supply chain due diligence, environmental and human rights due diligence. Again, there's been a lot of input. They invited consultation. It's under active debate. So there's a need for discussion about what is the role of AU on issues beyond, coup d'etats and things like that. There is something to be discussed. And of course, at the sub-regional level, who hears about ECOWAS? Who knows I don't know what they're doing. I really don't. And sometimes when you ask questions, people can be very condescending, or they say, don't you know, I'm with my gray hairs, how dare you challenge me? Or, don't you know I'm a chief? Or don't you know I'm a man? There are many ways there are many barriers we put so that you don't challenge and question and ask, you know? And I think we've come at a stage where debates are important. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've covered most of these things in my earlier presentation. I really want to thank you all. And Prof. Uju Ezejiofor talked about gender, and it's so important, right? Even in United States, there's a lack of diversity. You know, AI is white and male. How much more in Africa? And unless we address these things now, they're just going to reproduce themselves. And even in the countries, and that's why one of the points I talked about was decentering. Even when you get to Africa or in Nigeria, we talk about AI, but it's just at Abuja in Nigeria, maybe Abuja and Lagos. In South Africa, it's at the key cities. The discussion has not filtered down to the state level. Never mind the village level, right? But that is where the problems are, right? That's where the people that have the food insecurity problems and climate change issues, those are where they are. And unless we have a way of decentering, we'll just reproduce hierarchies that have always existed. Last point, legal history. Legal history is important. We need to go back and look at how African laws have interacted with changes and disruptions. And we don't do a lot of legal history, even at the legal education in Nigeria, but training in the West has taught me how important legal history is, right? What is the role of law and history and corporations in Africa? Has it been for good? Has it been for bad? What can we do so that we don't reproduce and replicate past mistakes that law and policy did in Africa? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Uche Wadokwa. Thank you for that. The next question will be for Damien and Madeline. I'm passionate about online dispute resolution, which is ODR. There's so much potential on the continent, given the numbers we have there, and given the fact that Tanzania, Nigeria, Kenya, a couple of other countries are interested in ODR. Don't you see this as a way forward for the African continent to be able to file its cases online, to do these things online? Isn't that progress? As opposed to what Damien said, that there isn't any progress at all on the continent. So could you respond to that, please? Damien and Madeline. Damien, could you start off, please?
Just your last bit. Did you say I said there was no progress?
You said there are limited progress on the continent. So I'm saying with regards to ODR, can't you see there has been some positivity there with regards to what Tanzania is doing, Kenya is doing, Nigeria is doing, Ghana and a couple of other countries are doing with regards to ODR? I know you did say earlier on that a number of organizations, African organizations, you work with in a bit to increase access to justice through the use of technological solutions.
Yeah, so specifically about ODR as opposed to AI, which is a different topic, and obviously there is a lot of talk about AI and ODR, and in terms of helping the decision process, maybe at the beginning and negotiation process, those kind of things. Talking about ODR in the sense of supporting access to justice, which is where I'm really coming from. There's the ability to, because courts are so full, and it takes years to get through many courts. What we need is a much cheaper, faster way to resolve disputes, and ODR is an absolutely excellent vehicle for that, to enable the use of just like mediation and arbitration to be used also than going to court. And there is growing demand for that in Africa, because of the court system, as much as anything, and the challenges of internet connection using ODR are becoming less and less of an issue, especially if the technology you're using has been specifically developed for low bandwidth environment. And so if you have the right technology, and you can bring people together who perhaps, because the transport infrastructure within Africa, I mean, it's quite difficult. There was a comment about e-commerce. One of the challenges for e-commerce, One is the payment side of it, and the other is actually moving the goods from A to B, because it's actually not that easy to get around Africa. By train or by truck or by plane, there's not always that easy to just get from the next country even. So those are issues. ODR in terms of resolving disputes, get by those things, because people can come together, they can be sat in their home, the solicitor's office, and they can resolve disputes in that way. And we're seeing demand in Nigeria for this, very much so, in Kenya, and some other places, but there's still a lot of places where there's just no interest at all. So I'm not sure I answered your question really. Thanks for listening.
You addressed it. You did address it. Yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, good.
Thank you. Yeah,
I'm sure Madeline did a lot better job.
Thank you, Madeline.
Oh,
Please,
well,
could you
thank you. Just not clocking just up to midnight here, but I will attempt my luck. Well, as Damien has noted, that ODR is something that is slightly different from what we've been discussing, which is AI. But there is an interlink whereby a lot have seen that AI can improve the efficiency of ODR support. And really, ODR is tagged as being the fourth party in ADR process, meaning the technology in an ADR process, meaning the automated part of it all, meaning using new tools, new systems, and new ways of administering or conducting that alternative dispute resolution mechanism that is in play. Now, in Tanzania, when we introduced iResolve in 2015, the environment was very different then, meaning that the pickup or the user end of embracing or accepting the platform and application of the platform was second to nil. And of course, anticipated by our strategy, knowing fully well that we will have to pull in the end user for them to accept this platform and use and apply it in their different dispute resolution mechanisms. But it took time. And so the readiness that we've been speaking about, even in AODR, was very hard to achieve in such a system when we implemented in 2015. But after the pandemic, we've seen a lot more pickup, and we've seen new projects come up supported by donors from a global reach, supporting ODR for access to justice, as Damien has highlighted. Access to justice initiatives are now on the ground taking form, because not only has the jurisdiction that I work in have these enabling provisions, well, at least an attempt to provide for electronic transaction laws, to provide for cybersecurity laws, to provide for all these enabling legislative pieces to enable these ODR portals or platforms or initiatives to actually take form and be acceptable. So recognizing them was one big step that the legislature made in order for ODR to pick up pace. Although in my opinion, a lot more can be done. And that's why I think we're here discussing not only AI, but how do we support these infrastructural changes to ensure that we have that full realization of what not only ODR, but AI can do for us all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You know, this conversation actually raised a lot of questions. One of the questions Dr. Ujedejofor Obasi raised was, there is no uniform set of rules for the African continent, which is true. So how do we address this particular question? Because you have the common law countries, you have the civil law countries. So how do we go about it? Professor Uche, could you please respond to that question, that there isn't any uniform set of rules for the African continent with regards to AI, if we have to go on AI conversation?
Yeah, I think the starting point is just to have the conversation, to get the conversation started. And I think that the barrier to having uniform rule is not the civil law, common law. After all, the EU, they're working towards common rules on a number of fronts. I mentioned two, but there are a long list of rules, whether it's data protection, due diligence that EU has that overcame those barriers. So I don't think that the problem is actually just, I think that there's just a massive reluctance in Africa to unite, to address. You may say that African countries, at least the governments, are maybe distracted with maybe what they might call immediate issues like food insecurity or climate change. You may say that the governments are distracted with things like, or they prioritize things differently. So things like military coups tend to get at the attention of AU, but not, so it's more a problem of priority. What is the priority? It's more a problem of looking at things from a long-term view. We tend to be a bit short-sighted in Africa. It's also a problem of not involving law. I think that in Africa, for the most part, law tends to be the last thing people think about. Law and policy is not prioritized, right? We jump into things and then we deal with it later. In other realms, for example, I work on bilateral investment treaties. And after so many years of treaty making, suddenly everybody's like, who signed this treaty? Who did this treaty? So we don't tend to think about things in the long term. So the AI, for example, because there's very lack of awareness about these issues, nobody is pushing, and because the AI development is occurring at, it's for now, as you saw some of the maps I put up, it's maybe Nigeria and South Africa and Kenya and a few other countries. The rest of the countries in Africa may have no interest in discussing it, right? If you brought it up, the question will be why this is not my business. So I think the solution might be perhaps more energy at the AU level. Perhaps instead of a continental wide, you might think about, starting with the countries that it affects most, right? Perhaps you can make it part of the African continental free trade, right? Because there are many countries that have ratified. So you have to think about creative ways to address some of these issues. But I will say that even on the areas where there's a lot of agreement, like say the African human rights system, all African countries have ratified the African Human Rights Charter, but implementation is lacking completely, right? So there's a problem with the lawmaking, there's a problem with the implementation, there's a problem with prioritization. But I think the starting point will be to even recognize some of these new issues and to recognize that fragmentation does not work in the interest of African countries, and that there's a need for a common position. And it may well be that we don't need continental rules, maybe, but it may well be that we need to come up with multilateral, be part of the multilateral engagement on these issues. One thing that is currently under discussion is the e-commerce, right? Before the WTO, there are two issues. There are discussions about e-commerce, and second, there's a discussion about investment facilitation. On both issues, African countries are not united. On the investment facilitation treaty that they're coming up with in the WTO, South Africa has said, no, we don't want it. India has said, no, we don't want it. And yet, we don't see an African position on that, right? On the e-commerce thing, again, India and South Africa have come out to oppose it. The rest of the countries in Africa seem not to understand what the issues are. So my point is that there are some problems at the African level. When it comes to AI regulation, you can think about it at the continental level, or you can think about it maybe at the multilateral level. Either way, there's just lack of full engagement by African states, and that needs to change. what the role of lawyers and organizations like ACIL in these things. I don't know. That's maybe another discussion that we can have, right? That may be the next project that you have, Ijoma, as you step away from your present post. How do we get the bar associations? Because the bar associations in Africa many times are not even, they're not into this. So we may want to think about the African Bar Association, how to get them informed about policies, how to get them to energize debates, because they're in touch with the local parliaments. They can better do some of these things. So I would suggest for ACIL African group that we can have some of these debates and discussions. The next thing is what next, right? Thank you so much.
Just a comment. Sorry, just a comment. Of course, a lot of politicians are lawyers.
That is true.
And so there is influence. There is that potential.
That is true.
Just need to be reminded they are lawyers and of these issues.
That is true.
So there is pressure that can be applied.
Yes, that is so true.
I just
No, that is absolutely true.
Thank you for that. We've actually raised more questions than answers. So let's go into solution, what we think the solution should be. My first question will be to Professor Suji. Professor Uche mentioned that although African countries within the top 50 countries on global readiness, so what do you think as the African continent could do to at least get into the list of top 50, at least top 100 countries under the global readiness list? What do you think could be the way forward? Professor Suji, please.
Thank you, Joma. I don't think there's a straight answer to that question because it's not just the topic of discussion here. I think any other socio-economic development indicators you can raise and ask the same question. And so I think the key thing is about infrastructure, legal, policy, physical, educational, social, cultural infrastructures are needed. So I think the first point is, let me work my way back from culture. There should be paradigm shift in the way the average African official, average African thinks. And what I mean here is we should be in a position to think that we can be part of the players, part of the big players. I've had occasions to be with some policymakers from different African countries. And there is this, some of them, you see this attitude of begging, that I am a beggar. In everything, I can't do it. I don't have the competence. Whereas when you look around, you see lots of Africans in different parts of the world. When COVID arrived 2 years ago or so, people were talking about solutions. Most of us wouldn't know that a lot of those vaccines had Africans as part of the development process. But then once the whole thing is completed, who do we see as the big poster developer of this vaccine in different places? But behind the scenes, you see loads of African technologies involved. So I think that culture shift of we can be a solution, we can actually provide a solution to people. I use the example of Ebola. Nobody talks about it, but I think that is a very good example of Africans working and tackling an issue. And the Ebola system of looking at a public health issue, the system was copied by some countries in order to deal with COVID. We don't talk about it. So we should be able to get different sectors of the African society to discuss, understand that we can do it in the first place. And if we take that position, then what do we need to do? We need to have the infrastructure in place. We have to have the infrastructure in place. Whatever we are talking, if we don't have a vibrant private sector, if we don't have quality primary, secondary, university education, and we are talking about technology, where are we going? If we don't have a legal system that would allow for rights to be recognized, enforced, as stated, what are we talking about? So for me, it's a fundamental question that if we want a change, we want to change the way we think, we will have to be able to think, what do we need? We need the law. And as lawyers, I think the lawyer has a very prominent role to play. Someone once asked me, some of the African countries, if you're given the opportunity, how do you resolve it? I always start with the lawyers first. If we're able to say, these are the rules of the game, ensure that we have the bar, the bench, every part of the legal profession involved in seeking for the best legal infrastructure. With the legal infrastructure, the other spaces for infrastructure, whether it's education, whether it is investment, climate, those things can come, but the law is very, very critical. And we've talked about whether the law can come from national system or regional. It can come from either. So if there is sufficient interest in one particular jurisdiction, they can serve as a model of how things can be done, come together. And I think my last point there is Africans in different parts of the world to try and get together more often to discuss African challenges, African opportunities, and how to address them, using our experiences in different places, using our knowledge of the context-specific issues and challenges and opportunities, we can get there. So I'm afraid I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I think that's the best I can. Thank you.
Yeah, fair enough. Thanks for that. I'm mindful of time. So the very last question will be for us to come up with answers, and this is for Dr. Riju Ezejofobasi. Riju, could you talked about, or rather, we've talked about AI running on data. How can the continent increase its data protection laws to increase the current state of 17% to at least 50%, which would be okay? What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, thank you, Joma. So first of all, there needs to be the political will to even do these things before we get to the law. Many African countries don't have the political will to create the framework that is needed for AI to thrive or to develop. And Professor Uche and Dr. Onyeka talked about, or Professor Onyeka talked about collaboration with the civil society, with the private sector, government and private sector. You know, I think that is really important because the collaboration will lead to better laws, better data protection laws. And these countries, like I said, these countries don't have the political will. Most of them don't even fully understand what AI is about. I know I've spoken to some people and they think when they hear artificial intelligence, technology, they think social media, you know. So most of these politicians are not, they're like, oh, they're for young people, you know, they go on social media. So there's lack of awareness. So we'll start, and that is where the lawyer comes in. So the lawyers are the ones that will create awareness to say, this is what data protection laws are, this is what they can do for you. And this is what AI means for the country. AI can help develop your country. AI can help shortages where it comes to medical access, when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to banking. So the lawyers have a critical role to play when it comes to, you know, creating awareness for these data protection laws and the benefits of data protection laws. And even when countries we have data labs coming in to invest in Africa, or rather to set up in Africa. If the environment is not conducive, I don't know how these labs can thrive. I don't know that they'll do a lot because private data needs to be protected. And so the lawyers have a lot of work to do and have a lot of convincing to do. African politicians are not the easiest to work with.
Yeah, agree.
So it's a lot of work. It can be done, but this conversation is a start. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. On this note, can we have a closing remarks on this conversation first we've just had, starting with Professor Uche Walokwa-Fodile, please. Your closing remarks.
I've talked at length, my closing remarks, that AI is very important. It's here to stay. It's going to disrupt. It's going to dismantle. It's going to destroy some things. It's going to develop. But the AI benefits are not automatic. They may not be distributed equitably, and that a good number of the benefits will go to the early movers. And so countries that sit out are going to do it to their own disadvantage, and countries that sit out are only setting themselves up for future exploitation. The change that is needed requires is a multi-stakeholder effort. We need input from the government, from civil society, from research institutions, from the private sector. We have not for a long time had that history of multi-stakeholderism in Africa. But it's important that we start, because when it comes to AI and all this technology, you need all the sectors coming together. If you do a study of think tanks, rankings of think tanks around the world, Africa fares very poorly. And some of the largest economies like Nigeria ranks very poorly. If you look at research institutions and universities, a lot of universities are applying for patents. My own university and many universities in the Western world have a strong IP department so that inventions are immediately, you file patents. Many countries in Africa, their universities are not strong on research and are not strong on protecting those research. And so when we talk about piracy, there's a lot of talk about piracy. That is where it comes in. The recent study from WIPO said that most of, I think about 80% of the patent filings related to AI came from the private sector. Again, in Africa, the private sector, as I showed you, are not very ready. So across the board, we need to sit up, not just because of AI, but across multiple things. I could talk about food security and the same issues will come in. I could talk about climate crisis, the same issues will come in. So it's time that Africa wakes up. We have been behind for so long. We did not reap the benefit of the first, second, and third. And even though people talk about leapfrogging is actually not as easy as it sounds. And it's not every time you can leapfrog. And so it's important that we start now and think about history, think about have a forward-looking proactive strategy, think about inclusivity. And it's very, very important that we engage at all levels, at the global, at the regional, and at the local level. The last thing I'll say is multilateralism has been in decline for quite some time. A good number of countries prefer the fragmented world that we have now. Some people benefit when the global governance is fragmented. It's people that have voice and power that benefit when you have fragmentation, you know? So you're not quite sure which forum to focus on. It's countries that have resources that benefit when global governance is fragmented. Are you gonna focus on the WTO? Or are you gonna focus on WIPO? Are you gonna focus on the fragmentation? So for a long time, multilateralism has been in decline. Multi-stakeholderism has been in decline. And with AI, there's a danger of tech dominance by the private sector in a way that may not be good. So I think it's important that we wake up and think about partnerships, you know, partnerships across, not just within Africa, but across with other emerging economies. But in everything, I think that somebody said here that we're always on the beggar mode, right? We're always asking for capacity aid and, you know, all those things. I think it's time that we change from that beggar mode and think about how to take the future in our hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Che Molokwa-Fadile. You made a very good point, which was Putin said, he who controls AI controls the world. That's quite interesting. Thank you for that. The next closing remarks would come from Damien, please.
So the beggar mode is a very good expression. Unfortunately, Africa is walking same road it's walked for many years, and it's going to blame everybody except actually the only blame is Africa itself, and I don't mean every African person. I mean the politicians mostly, unfortunately. And unless things change very soon, that blame game is going to continue. So I think enough has been said. So that would be my sum up.
Thank you. The next closing remarks from Madeline, please. I know it's time, it's almost midnight over there. Bear with us.
Thank you, Joma. Thank you for the opportunity to give a closing remark. I commend Professor Uche's work. The research was a deep dive, and I thank you for sharing it with us all. For me, as a closing remark, and we've heard a lot during our discussions back and forth, it's critical now that we now determine a strategic direction. We've heard of certain solutions coming in, from Professor Osuji, in terms of how do we take it forward in terms of AI and the legal framework. Do we go generally or issue by issue or both? And I think this is where my concern is, because lack of regulation is not something that we're open to, but also over-regulation could be something that could pose challenges within our societies. So let's get back, I go back to my comment of going back to the brainstorming board and being able now to dissect each element, each issue that has come up from our discussions, from gender issues, from discrimination, bias and data protection. How then do we move to put enabling provisions that are African centric and also respond to the fast pace of this revolution or this movement that we are witnessing in terms of AI. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. The next closing remark from Dr. Uju is Ejiofor-Basi, please.
Thank you, Joma. And thank you, panelists. It's been a very enlightening session. Most of what I take away from this discussion is the disconnect in the collaboration between the public sector and the private sector in Africa. There's not a lot of that going on. And AI is in Africa, most of the AI development is within the private sector. You see startups, young folks hustling, using their background to do things, no support from government. And most of the time, there's no interest from the government to even hear from them, to see what they are doing, what they need. So there's no enabling environment. There needs to be conversations. There needs to be, collaboration. And there needs to be, like I said before, a political will. They don't even understand what AI is. So how do we move forward? And so that needs to be addressed. And that's something to think about, going forward, how to sensitize the government on what AI means and how it's good for them and for the government, for the for delivery of public services, for the country, to move the country forward, or the countries forward. Thank you.
Thank you. The last speaker, Professor Suji, please, your closing remark.
Thank you, Joma, and thanks once again to organizers of this event, a wonderful event. And thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Professor Uche Woluko-Fodile. I think my mood for most of the session was the mood of a student learning so much. I used to think I had an idea of what AI means, but I've ended up knowing that I've still got a lot of work to do. So thank you for that, for the presentation. I think I will end, I think I will end on a very positive note, which is that change can come from different places. Change can come from up, can come from bottom, it can come from the side. So yes, a lot of issues we have with Africa as a continent, African governments, African countries, you trace them to the political leadership, working hand in hand with the economic elite, because the economic elite in most countries is often connected with the political leadership. But at the same time, for us, the ordinary Africans, wherever we are, AI can be an opportunity for us to be involved. It provides, like some of the digital technologies, opening up opportunities for conversations between different peoples, different organizations. So AI can also be an opportunity for us to see how we can work together across disciplines, across jurisdictions, to understand what some of those issues are, to communicate our understanding of what the issues are, of what the solutions can potentially be, discuss them, provide dissemination, and organize ourselves. I'll go back to the issue of, the population of African countries, how young. The good thing is that digital technology is creeping in most of African societies. So that's an opportunity we can use to, as maybe from the side or from the bottom, however we want to put it, try to point some of these issues, try to also exploit the opportunities. I remember I've seen some cases of African startups in technology-based businesses. So things are happening. So we can still be able to, despite the weak political governance structure, do things. So let me end on that to say that regulation can be from the government, from the regional institution. It can also come from self. So thank you so much for the wonderful evening.
Thank you, Professor Suji. Thank you for that. We've come to the end of the session. And I just want to get some clarification. Professor Uche Walokwa-Fodile, is it possible to get the slides, or would that be, I don't know, is it something you can share with us? Or I don't know.
You're putting me on the spot. I will share it with you.
Okay, perfect. That's good. On this note, we've come to the end of this session, and I say thank you very much to Professor Uche Walokwa-Fodile, I guess, a keynote speaker. Thank you very much for an insightful discussion. There's so many questions raised, and we'll think about the answers. And thank you very much once again. An honor. Thank you. To Damien, thank you so much for coming around. To Professor Suji, thank you very much. To Dr. Ujie Dejofobasa, thank you very much. And to Melly, I know it's past midnight over there. I'm so sorry I have to keep you this long. I'm so sorry. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you so much. Thank you.
It has been a true delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your time and for
your
comments.
Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Professor Uche, my god sister.
Thank you, Damien. I hope to catch up.
Damien. Thank you.
Good to see all of you.
And thank you to Acela. Thank you to James. Thank you so much for all the.
It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you.